Good afternoon. My name is Ethan, and I am the chair of Equip Ministries. We are an evangelical student-run ministry on Hillsdale's campus, and essentially what we seek to do is partner with local gospel-centered churches and bring local pastors, teachers to campus, and then connect students to those local churches. So, and sometimes we have the pleasure of hosting speakers from outside of campus to come, and that's obviously what we're doing today. So, Katy Faust is the founder and president of Them Before Us, a global movement of defending children's right to their mother and father. She publishes, speaks, and testifies widely on why marriage and family are matters of justice for children. Her articles have appeared in Newsweek, USA Today, The Federalist, Public Discourse, World Magazine, The Daily Signal, The Washington Examiner, The American Mind, and The American Conservative. In 2021, Ms. Faust, along with her co-author Stacey Manning, published Them Before Us, Why We Need a Global Children's Rights Movement. In 2023, they published a second book, Raising Conservative Kids in a Woke City, in which they detailed their philosophy of worldview transmission. Ms. Faust is on the advisory board for the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship and helped design the teen edition of CannaVox, which studies sex, marriage, and relationships from a perspective of divine law, of natural law. She frequently contributes to organizations such as Alliance Defending Freedom, Focus on the Family, the Heritage Foundation, and the Colson Center. She is married to Ryan and has 4 teenage children. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Katy Faust.
It's so good to be here. Little story time. 5 years ago, I was at this very podium. And about 4 weeks before I was here, I didn't know what Hillsdale was. And they invited me to come speak. And I was like, all right, let's check it out. I had a senior in high school at the time who was applying for colleges. And I said, hey, you want to come with me? There's this school called Hillsdale. It's in Michigan. You just want to check it out? So she came with me. And we were like, what is this fairyland? What is this place where people can leave their computer out for a day or two and come back and make sure that it's still there, and where you stay up until 1 a.m. listening to a Catholic priest and an Orthodox priest and a Baptist pastor and a Lutheran minister debate where they can work together and where they can't work together? And she ended up applying, being admitted, graduated last year, 6 months after she married her fiance, and now they're off and running into their new life. So it's very fun to come full circle to the place where it all began. The last time I was here, we had just published our first book, Them Before Us, Why We Need a Global Children's Rights Movement, where I talked specifically about how every marriage and family issue needed to be looked at through the lens of justice for children. Whether you were talking about the definition of marriage, or divorce, or the rise of cohabitation, or modern families, or reproductive technologies, or adoption, or thruples, or the definition of parenthood, or who goes on a birth certificate. If it had to do with children, if it had to do with marriage, if it had to do with parenthood, if it had to do with relationships, ultimately, children are victimized when we get those questions wrong. So today we're going to narrow our focus a little bit. We're going to talk specifically about reproductive technologies. I'm going to hone in on IVF, surrogacy, and sperm and egg donation, because this is an area where, unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion, even among the right and even among the Christian right. So I'm going to talk with you, and we're going to do this quick. I'm going to get through the meat of the presentation in 25 minutes, and then we are just going to do Q&A, because that's what I want. I want to hear the questions that you have, the things that you struggle to answer, the areas where you're seeing friction in your worldview as it relates to reproductive technologies. So I want to talk about how the process of IVF and the other third-party interventions that often go along with IVF victimizes children, specifically their right to life, their right to their mother and father, and their right to be born free and not bought and sold. So let's begin with children's right to life. You guys are students at Hillsdale. Somebody tell me when a child's right to life begins. When do children begin to have a right to life? You, striped shirt. At the moment of conception. What's your name? Grace gets 1,000 children's rights points. Good job, Grace. Thank you very much. So children have a right to life from the moment of conception. If that is true, then the baby-making industry of IVF is victimizing more unborn children than the baby-taking industry of abortion by probably a magnitude of 4. So anybody know about how many children are aborted each year in this country? Who wants to guess? Hands? Gentleman next to a 1,000-point winner already. How many? Yeah, close to 1 million. That's exactly right. We, according to our best estimates, believe that probably around 4 million children lose their right to life through the process of IVF. Now, how can that be? Has anybody ever here done sidewalk counseling or prayed outside an abortion clinic? Raise your hand if you've ever done something like that. Okay. Typically, the women that are going into those clinics, about how many children are you trying to convince her to save? About 1. That's exactly right. Most women who are pregnant, who are in an unplanned pregnancy, typically are debating the lives of one child, maybe 2 if they've got twins. But for the couple, we don't really know averages, but the typical couple that is having very planned children and going to the clinic to help them achieve pregnancy, they have anywhere between 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 little lives that are hanging in the balance there. Now, no intended couple, well, very few intended couples are going to raise 25 children. There are a few cases around the globe where you've got people mass producing children. You've got the billionaire single man in Japan who's produced about 20 children through surrogacy and IVF and is raising them in sort of a nanny factory in Japan. You've got the Russian millionaire couple where they've got about 20 children who are all probably around the age of 4 or 5 now, that were all born in the same year, genetically related to the husband and wife, but created through multiple surrogates. But typically, the people that are creating children through IVF are not going to raise 20 children. Paris Hilton has gone through IVF a couple different times. Does anybody know, through her first couple rounds, how many embryos she created in her first 2 rounds of IVF? Any guesses? 20. Right, she created 20 embryos. Unfortunately for those embryos, they were all males. And Paris Hilton didn't want a boy. She wanted a girl. So she went through IVF again, and she did achieve a pregnancy. She did achieve embryo that was female and implanted that baby. And what do you think is going to happen to the 20 boys? Any guesses? Yeah, exactly. And really, what this looks like is thawing and discarding them or donating them to research. So we've got a problem of surplus embryos on our hands in this country. Anywhere from 1 million to up to 10 million frozen children in this country. And we've got frozen orphanages scattered all across the nation. By some accounts, 20 to 40% of them have been functionally abandoned. We cannot contact the parents. They're no longer paying the storage fee. Maybe the parents have already died because these children are often 30 years old. And so this idea that IVF is just about making babies, what we see when we look at the scope of the waste of human life is that IVF is much more about creating babies. It really is about creating on-demand designer babies shipped worldwide. And the way that you do that is by mass producing embryos and then only keeping the ones that make the grade, that make it through the pre-implantation screening, that survive the freeze, that survive the thaw, that survives the selective reduction, and then make it to birth alive. So our best estimate, and when I'm going to use a lot of estimates here as it relates to the baby-making industry of IVF, because there are no requirements in this country, in any state, that requires fertility clinics or doctors to track and report and share how many little lives they make and what they do with them. So we have to piece together the numbers based on a few reports here and there by various clinics. And so we've just got best guesses here. But our best guess is that about 2% to maybe at the high end, 7% of children who are made in a laboratory will be born alive. Probably 3% is about as close as we can get. So 97% of children that are made in a laboratory will not make it through the process. There is a gauntlet that these little humans have to go through if they want to be born alive. So typically what happens is you will create a child in a petri dish, IVF, in vitro fertilization, fertilization that takes place in glass. You'll allow the baby to develop to 5 to 7 days, and then you grade it. You will literally you'll give the baby a grade. You'll give the embryos a grade, AA, BB, CC, DD. And if you go to Instagram, you can find all different kinds of accounts of people talking about their cryo babies or their ember babies, where they will show how many children they attempted to conceive, how many they fertilized, how many of them made it to the blastocyst phase of like 5 to 7 days, how many of them were deemed viable, which is, again, a pretty subjective term, how many of them made the grade, right? Did they have 4A grade embryos and then maybe 3B grade embryos and then another 5 that were C and D grade embryos? Well, what are they going to do with the C and D grade embryos? They'll donate them to research or they will discard them. And then of the A grade embryos, maybe they will transfer 1 or 2 and they will freeze the rest. And then if they transfer 2, let's say 1 boy and 1 girl, and both of them take, and then one of them twins, then very often you've got a significantly high-risk pregnancy. IVF itself is a high-risk pregnancy. It's always categorically a high-risk pregnancy. IVF children are about 55% more likely to be born premature with all of the attending health conditions that go along with premature birth. Twins, multiples, is always a high-risk pregnancy, so you pair IVF and multiples with what is very often a geriatric pregnancy, a woman that's pregnant over the age of 35, which a lot of the women that are seeking IVF are women that are past that prime maternal age. Now you've got a really significant risk for the mother. So what do you think that doctors will encourage that woman to do if she is 38 years old, she implanted a boy and girl embryo that are IVF created, and then the girl twins, and she's got a boy and 2 girls? What do you think the doctors are going to recommend her to do for the sake of her health? You. Abort. They have a very clinical term for that. It's called selective reduction. And that is you select which child should be reduced. And it's abortion, right? Abortion between 12 and 20 weeks. So you put all of those different factors together. The grading, the pre-implantation screening, which is going to weed out the children who have Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, other genetic abnormalities. Those kids aren't even going to get graded. They'll just get discarded, even though we do have some evidence that those embryos can self-correct. And obviously, there's a lot of false positives with those kinds of tests. But between the grading, the pre-implantation screening, the freezing, the thawing, the transfer, the selective reduction, you get to the point where really only 2 to 3% of embryos that are created in the laboratory will be born alive. So Then Before Us, my nonprofit, is probably one of the most public-facing organizations that is critical of IVF because it violates the rights of children. And we very often will have people come to us and say, why do you think that these children are less than? Why do you think that they're not worthy of life? And my answer is, you're the one that thinks they're not worthy of life. I'm so grateful for every child that made it through the gauntlet alive. I just wish I had met their siblings. I just want the other 97% of children to have the same kind of protection and dignity that the 2% that were born alive were afforded. So the bottom line is, as it comes to children's right to life, if you really believe children have a right to life from the moment of conception, we now have a 2-front war on our hands. We have to fight against the baby-taking industry of abortion, and we have to fight against the baby-making industry of IVF. But there's another problem with IVF, and that is once you're making babies outside of the sexual embrace, once you're making a baby in a laboratory, it is just as easy to use somebody else's egg or somebody else's sperm to make that baby. So again, we don't have hard numbers, but our best estimate is that anywhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of children that do make it through the gauntlet of all of the different risk factors that stand between the conception in glass to being born alive, even if you do make it through that, and you're one of the 2% that are born alive, which is, we guess, about 90,000 children a year, 30,000 to 60,000 of them are going to lose the relationship with their mother or father or both at the moment of conception, because a third party's egg or a third party's sperm is going to be used to create that child. So there's big problems with this, even if the child ends up going home to a heterosexual couple, because there are certain things that biological parents offer to their children that unrelated adults do not. Here's two things specifically. One is biological identity. It is very hard for kids to answer the question, who am I, if they cannot answer the question, whose am I? There is something specific that only those two adults, their own genetic mother and their own genetic father, offer them that no other adults can offer them. Now, we know this because we have seen a drastic shift in adoption best practice over the last 50 years. Back in the 60s and 70s, when adoption kind of hit its first wave, after the sexual revolution, after the widespread use of contraceptives, which very often didn't contracept, but they allowed for a whole new crop of children born to unwed mothers, while there was still a stigma on unwed motherhood. Those children then ended up being adopted out, largely white children to largely white parents. And those children struggled, even though they were raised by a mother and a father in middle-class families and tended to be better off. But there was something, even about that wave, that first wave of adoptees, that indicated that something needed to change about adoption. And that is that children benefit from as many connections as possible with their first family, even if they can't be raised by them. So back in the 60s and 70s, there were virtually no open adoptions. Open adoption is when the child has some kind of contact, knowledge of, or relationship with their birth family. Today, that is really flipped. Does anybody want to guess what percentage of adoptions in the United States today are closed adoptions, where there's no contact, no information, no knowledge of the child's first family? Any guesses? How many adoptions today are closed adoptions? You. 7-0? Good guess. Pink sweater. 10 to 15, closer. Any others? It's only 5%. So it is now best practice in the world of adoption to encourage and facilitate open adoptions whenever possible, because it helps the child develop and formulate a stable self-identity in ways that even being raised by a emotionally healthy heterosexual couple cannot. So let's look at this another way as it relates to a child discovering their biological identity. I want you to think about a great work of literature or a book or a movie where a child goes on a search for their long-lost, missing mother's boyfriend. Anything? No? Okay, give me an example of a story or a movie where a child goes on a search for their long-lost missing father. Yeah. Mamma Mia, good. What else, you? Elf? Yes, classic. Over here? Okay, we know what generation we're in. Okay, if you were my generation, you'd be saying American Tail or Land Before Time. Any others? Star Wars? Yes. Luke, I am your stepfather. Like, who cares? Nobody. But because it was Luke's father, it plunges him into this identity crisis, right? Because biology tells us something about who we are. And so what we've got right now happening in the world of reproductive technologies is the exact opposite of what we've established as the best practice in adoption, which is very often intentional and favoring anonymous arrangements so the children will never have contact with one or their both biological parents. And predictably, these children who are created, even if it's just a sperm donor, even if it's not a sperm and egg donor, and when I say donor, that's a misnomer. I mean, in the world of reproductive technologies, this is not a benevolent nonprofit. Everybody is buying sperm, and everybody is selling sperm. Everybody is buying eggs, everybody is selling eggs. This is a marketplace. So in the world of sperm donation, these children who have been created some of them are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. They overwhelmingly, disproportionately struggle with identity issues because it's very hard for them to answer the question, who am I? because their father sold them. So we destabilize children's relationships when we minimize the importance of biological parents. Now, I say that not just as an adoptive mother, but as a woman who used to be the assistant director of the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world. And here we see a really dramatic difference between adoption and reproductive technologies. In both of these situations, whether it is sperm donation, egg donation, embryo adoption, or surrogacy, these children have lost something. They've lost a relationship with one or both adults to whom they have a natural right. And they are mourning, and they are sad, and they very often deal with identity issues. These children who are adopted have also lost someone to whom they have a natural right, their birth mother or their birth father. But these children are being raised by the adults who are seeking to mend their wound, not the ones who inflicted it, not the ones who chose it, not the ones that paid for that mother or father to be gone from their life. These children over here are being raised by the adults who inflicted the wound, who arranged for their mother or father to stay out of their life forever. And so that puts the burden on the child over here to process very often alone and in isolation, which is why the one study that we have that compares outcomes between children who are raised through sperm donors, who often had either a single mother, a mother and a social father, or a mother and a female partner, and children who are raised over here by an adoptive parent. So this child's disconnected from both mother and father. This child at least has their biological mother. The sperm donor conceived child struggled more with substance abuse, with identity questions, with trusting their parent, whereas adoptees tended to have higher levels of trust. They tended to show lower levels of distress when they saw, for example, somebody being raised by their biological parent. It didn't bother the adoptee as much as it bothered the child being raised by the sperm donor. And that's because this child very often has to deal with the fact that the people that are raising them wanted it that way. So they have to process their grief alone. I'll tell you the other reason why it's very risky to separate a child from their mother or father at conception, or through divorce, or through abandonment. And it is because a child's own genetic mother and father are statistically the most connected to, invested in, and protective of them. So there's exceptions. There are situations where a child's own biological mother or father is abusive or neglectful. That is certainly the case sometimes. But there is no household arrangement, there's no structure where that improves if you swap in another adult and swap out the mother or father. So I want you to get your phones out. We're going to do a little thought experiment here, because so much of what's taking place, especially in conversations around family structure, around reproductive technologies, around modern families, many of whom acquire their children through reproductive technologies like IVF, sperm and egg donation, and surrogacy, is things like kids don't need a mom and dad. They just need to be safe and loved. Or kids don't need a male parent and a female parent. They just need to be nurtured. Or if the adults are happy, the kids will be happy. Or kids don't need a biological mother and father. They need two parents. So let's just test that theory, shall we? I want you to Google, not ChatGPT, because I really want to prove something here. I want you to Google the words mother's boyfriend. Google mother's boyfriend. Because if a biological connection with a child is irrelevant, if any two will do, if the kids are going to be happy, if the adults are happy, then children being raised by their mother and her cohabiting boyfriend are going to be doing great because they have two parents, their adults are happy, the parents are happy, they've got their mother, they even have a father figure. So these kids should be thriving. So tell me, what did you see when you Googled mother's boyfriend? Raise your hand and I want you to yell it out. What'd you see? Okay, top 3, child abused by mother's boyfriend. What'd you get? Teenager decapitates mother's boyfriend in knife attack. What else? Somebody here, yeah. I'm really disturbed by what my mom's boyfriend says. What else? You. Child abused my mother's boyfriend? I hate my mom's boyfriend. Anything else? It will go on and on and on and on and on and on and on. There will be endless returns. You cannot read fast enough to get through the headlines that continue to appear. And you will see, if you keep going page after page, the most disturbing headlines about child abuse, filicide, torture that you're going to find anywhere online. And that is because if a child is raised by an unrelated adult, especially an unrelated cohabiting man, statistically, he is the most dangerous person in a child's life. Sociologist Brad Wilcox says the most dangerous place a child can find themselves in America today is in the home of an unrelated man left to care for the child himself. So our whole modern family arrangement is built upon the fact that biology doesn't matter. And we've got an entire IVF industry that makes it possible to separate a child from a genetic parent and then reattach them to a biological stranger at the moment of conception. So we're not just messing with children's identities, we are messing with the fundamental mechanisms to keep them safe. So IVF violates children's right to life. It very often violates their right to their mother and father. But it also violates their right to be born free and not bought and sold. I'm going to talk briefly about surrogacy. I'm going to explain from the children's rights perspective what surrogacy is, and then I'm going to contrast surrogacy and adoption. And then we're going to do questions, so be thinking about your most pressing questions. What surrogacy is. Now, there's a lot of opposition to surrogacy from different sectors. You've got bioethic concerns, you definitely have feminist concerns. I personally think that there's holes in a lot of those arguments, but the ironclad argument against surrogacy is that in 100% of cases, it always forces children to sacrifice for adults. It always forces the weak to sacrifice for the strong. And if you want to talk about a definition of justice, it would be that the strong sacrifice the weak and the strong protect the weak. And surrogacy is always an inversion of that dynamic. It is always the weak sacrificing for the strong. So this is the child-centric way to think about what surrogacy is. Surrogacy splices what should be one person, mother, into three purchasable and optional women. The first one is the genetic mother. That would be the egg donor, the one that gives the child their biological identity, the one that offers the resemblance, that provides the connection to the kinship network, that connects the child to their heritage, the one that helps the child answer the question, who am I? The second mother is the birth mother. This is the person with whom the child forms their critical bond for the first 9 months of life. And we've measured the distress that children experience indirectly when the child is separated from their mother after birth. There's something about that woman, her body, her smell, her milk, the sound of her heartbeat that drops baby's cortisol levels, her smell especially, that has a soothing impact on the child in a way that nobody else's body or skin can offer. We do not place newborns on the chest of random men or unrelated women or the nurses in the room so they can establish a bond. We place the baby on the mother's chest because they have an existing bond. And it is her body that calms the baby down. We have measured it. Connection and touch with mom drops cortisol levels. This is how it works. Baby's cortisol goes up when they're stressed, hungry, tired, scared, cold. Babies cannot drop their own cortisol levels. The only thing that drops a baby's cortisol levels is an increase in oxytocin. That only happens through skin-to-skin contact. And it is mom's skin-to-skin contact that releases the most oxytocin and allows baby to be soothed and then ultimately develop to the point where they can soothe themselves. Babies do not have the ability to soothe themselves. The birth mother functions, in essence, as Erica Komisar will say, as the baby's central nervous system for the first many months of a child's life. So when we cut out the birth mother from the child's life, in essence, we set the clock back to zero. They're 9 months behind every other child. And they experience that as a primal wound. And we know this because there are adoptees who lost their mother on the date that they were born, not through commercial processes, but sometimes through tragedy, who report that primal wound. There's actually a book called The Primal Wound. It's known as the Adoptee's Bible because it so accurately describes what so many adoptees who were adopted at birth, very often into loving, wonderful, nurturing, better educated, wealthy, heterosexual couples who still experienced struggles to trust and attach, terror that they were going to be abandoned, even when they were 7 years old or 17 years old. You cannot mess with that primal bond and not tinker and possibly put the child at risk forever when it comes to primary relationship development. The third role of mother, so genetic mother, birth mother, the third role is the social mother. This is the female presence in the child's life every day. This is the one that offers them the distinct feminine role that increases and aids their development in a way that a male parent cannot. If I can boil it down to the tightest argument I can for the distinction between mothers and fathers, it's that mothers promote attachment and fathers promote separation. If you only have attachment, the child never learns independence or risk-taking. If you only have separation, the child is very often emotionally dysregulated and unstable. So let's just do another quick thought experiment here, just to demonstrate to you all that there really is a distinction between male and female parents. I want you to raise your hand and raise it high and keep it up until I tell you to put it down. I want you to raise your hand if you've ever seen a baby thrown up in the air. Okay, look around. How many people have seen a baby thrown up in the air? So everybody here, I think, has their hand raised. Now keep it up. I want you to put your hand down if the person throwing the baby, no, keep your hand up if the person throwing the baby was a woman. Okay, I think we've got 4, 5, maybe 7 female baby throwers that are in your world. Okay. Women don't throw babies. This is not something that men have to learn. I've gone to South Carolina and I've gone to South Korea. And in both of those places, men throw babies. In both of those places, women wear babies. You can just see it in the way they interact with children. Their physical interaction with children says women promote attachment and men promote separation. When you have those two human elements together every day, all the child's life, you get a developmentally balanced child. It is not something that a man can switch on. A man cannot simply say, I'm going to be a nurturer and I'm going to promote attachment in my child. Men simply don't respond to, especially infants, the way women do. They've measured, for example, male sensitivity to infant cries. A man will wait about twice as long. The man will let the baby cry about twice as long as the woman will, right? The woman hears the baby crying, she gets up and she's like, I can't handle it, I'm gonna grab that baby. I was on a plane last month and there was this baby crying behind me and then there was a baby crying in front of me, and it turns out it was twins. They couldn't sit in the same row for some reason. So finally, they let the babies both sit together behind me. And one of the women was the au pair, who was brand new and didn't know what she was doing. So you had one mom trying to, and the au pair like, ah. And I finally stood up and I was like, please give me that baby, give me the baby, give me that baby. And the baby was, right, fine, because moms know how to rock, soothe, and pat just right, right? There's something about that maternal rock and sway and move and nurture and attach and soothe. It's almost innate. So surrogacy allows you to say, of these 3 women, genetic mother, birth mother, and social mother, which one do you not need? Which one are you going to purchase? Which one are you going to rent? Which one are you going to do without together? In surrogacy, the baby's always going to lose their birth mother. But it's not going to be because there's a crisis situation. It's not going to be because of tragedy. It's going to be because of commercial transactions and intentionality. But often the child will also lose their genetic mother. They're going to be dealing with the identity struggles that other children created through sperm and egg donation are dealing with. And sometimes those children are going to go home to a household where there's no female presence at all. It'll be a single father, a double father, or a triple father. And the child will be starved of that critical female love completely. And this is why reproductive technologies violate a child's right to be born free and not bought and sold. It is because in these kinds of arrangements, whenever you're using a third party, somebody else's sperm, somebody else's egg, somebody else's womb, you're paying the sperm seller, the egg seller, or the womb renter. Now, some people will say, well, yeah, but that happens in adoption too. Anybody's parents adopted here? Raise your hand if you're adopted or if your parents adopted somebody else. Okay, so they probably paid some money. They may have paid $20,000, $30,000. I don't know if it was domestic, I don't know if it was international, but I'll tell you something true about every single one of them. None of their money went to the birth mother, the birth father, to have that mother or father hand over their parental rights to acquire the child. If that happened, if money went from the intended parents to the birth parents, that's no longer adoption. That is trafficking. I used to be responsible for compliance at our Chinese adoption agency. International, federal, and state standards prohibited money ever going from the adoptive parents to the birth parents. What you pay for in adoption is extreme amounts of vetting and screening, right? We paid the Chinese government to review our profile. We paid for the US government to decide whether or not we could bring our son into the country. We paid the state of Washington to approve us. We paid our home study agency to evaluate us. We paid our placement agency to make sure that we were in line with Chinese standards. We paid to have our fingerprints done. We paid to have our doctor fill out forms saying that we were healthy enough. We got references from our friends validating that we're not going to abuse the child, and they've seen us parent our other children. The money that is paid for adoption goes to ensuring that the child is going to be as much as we can try to replicate in the world of institutionalized adoption, is trying to ensure that the child genuinely is going to be safe and loved. It does not go directly from adoptive parents to birth parents. That's trafficking. But in the world of big fertility, it always goes directly to the birth parents, to the sperm seller, to the egg seller. If you're donating your eggs or selling your sperm, part of that contract is to say, you have no claim over the child that will result from this. Part of what goes on when you sign a surrogacy contract is you will be paid $30,000, but you're actually going to relinquish your parental rights, not after an adoption, not after birth like adoptive parents. You're going to do it before the baby's even born through something called a pre-birth order. You will legally orphan your child, and that's what we're paying you for. So we have, through reproductive technologies, especially surrogacy, the exact definition of trafficking according to adoption standards. So once you start making babies in a laboratory, it's very easy to involve somebody else's sperm, egg, or womb. It's very easy to victimize children, violate their right to life. And it's very easy to cut their mother and father out completely. So I'm going to stop there. I'd love to hear your questions. Come on up. Good. Yeah, clap first and then come up. Great idea.
Thank you. So, what arguments, secular or Christian, that have you heard that are most compelling, and what would your response to them be?
You're saying what arguments?
Excuse me, for IVF.
Okay, for IVF.
Yes.
So here's the thing. When you're looking at it from the adult's perspective, it's all compelling, right? If this has to do with giving adults what they want, there's tons and tons of reasons to do all of this, right? If the focus is on the adults and their longings, their desires, maybe even their very legitimate, I would say God-given ache to have a baby, then all of this is permissible. But if you look at it from the child's perspective, none of it is. None of it is. It's always asking the weak to sacrifice for the strong. And even the children that do make it through the process alive, connected to their own mother and father, virtually no child is going to make it through that process without their embryonic siblings being lost in the process. So, I think all of us are pretty clear on abortion. Abortion says, if a child is unwanted, I can violate their right to life and force them out of existence. IVF says, if a child is very wanted, I can violate probably many child's right to life, and maybe some children's right to their mother and father, and force them into existence. Like, both of these are actually two sides of the same child commodifying coin. So our job, I would say the majority of what I do as a children's rights activist, is taking any story that breaks any trending news item, any new technological breakthrough, and taking the spotlight off of the adults who really, really want something and will be sad if they don't get it, and shining it onto the child who will be victimized if the adults get what they want. So there's all kinds of great arguments that you can make if you're looking at it from the perspective of these poor suffering adults, but if you look at it through the lens of child victimization, I don't think there's any good arguments. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask, what countries are handling the IVF problem better? I know, for instance, that Germany has the Embryo Protection Act. I'm just curious to see, what sort of legislation you think America would do well to employ.
Good. So I think the question is, which if you can turn up the question, mics, that would be awesome. Maybe you can hear it, but I can't. I think the question is, what countries are doing this well? Who could we pattern ourselves after? The truth is, the only way that I think you could do this well is to recognize that children are humans from the moment of conception and treat them like that. So you've got some state, which would virtually eliminate all of IVF. I mean, that's actually what happened February of last year when the Alabama Supreme Court awarded 3 different couples whose embryos were mistakenly destroyed because they were mishandled by a clinic. Go ahead, you want to say something else?
Oh, no, I was just going to say that ended up being, you can finish.
Yeah,
what
so
they punished them with.
these 3 parents, they sued the clinic because somebody mishandled one of the frozen cryo storage units, dropped it on the ground, and their embryos were destroyed. So they brought a case, they sued the clinic, and they said, we're going to sue you under a wrongful death claim because you destroyed our children. And the Supreme Court handed down, the Alabama court handed down the most pro-life decision that we've ever had, which said, yes, those are your children. You can sue the clinic. What happened as a result? Every hospital and clinic in Alabama ground to a halt. Nobody would do IVF. They stopped completely. They said, wait a second. If we cannot destroy embryonic life, we cannot do business here. We will withdraw from the state. And that's actually what you had leading up to the Dobbs decision as well. You had fertility doctors saying, all of these states that have trigger laws that say that children have a right to life from the moment of conception, I just want to let you know that if Roe versus Wade is overturned, and those states that say that you can't have an abortion from the moment of conception because children have a right to life, I just want to let you know, no IVF is going to be done in that state. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that they literally cannot do business without what they would call making sure that the healthiest embryos survive, which just means destroying the undesirables. So what would real good legislation look like? Just recognizing that children have a right to life and a right to their mother and father, and it would eliminate pretty much all IVF cycles. I've now spoken at conferences with hundreds, thousands of people, and everybody asks, which I would say 3 of you guys in line are going to ask me this, so I'll just say it up front now. Can you do IVF in a way that's moral or ethical? And the answer is, can you do, well, first of all, what are ethics, right? Are you going to appeal to your religious authority, in which case you need to have some conversations with your priest or your pastor or, the Christian ethics and ethicists in your life? Are you going to appeal to children's rights, which I would say, if you're going to do that, that means you only create the number of embryos that you intend to immediately implant. You don't freeze any of them. You don't use any kind of genetic screening. You don't grade any of them. They're never frozen, because once they go in the freezer, they rarely come out. And then you do that every single time you want to repeat the cycle. There's about a 30 to 35% success rate if you're in your 20s doing IVF. If you're in your 40s, there's a 20% success rate. You typically need to do 5 or 6 rounds of IVF to get, after 5 or 6 rounds, 2/3 of couples will have a live birth. After 5 to 6 rounds. Now, how much is every round? $12,000 to $25,000? So it's so much better to just make 20 embryos up front, have them in storage, and transfer them whenever you have another IVF failure. So if you're going to do this in a way that doesn't violate any child's right to life or right to their mother and father, there's no freezing, there's no grading, there's no pre-implantation screening. You're going to implant every embryo immediately. You're going to carry them to term even if it's high risk. You're not going to do any selective reduction. And I've now talked to like hundreds, thousands of people at this point, and I've said that's the only way you can do it without victimizing child's right to life or right to their mother and father. And I've met 5 couples that have done it that way. A couple of them froze some children, but they went back for all of them. And they're like, hey, I want to let you know we did that. And I said, okay, did you fight your doctor? And they go, yep. Our doctor didn't want us to do it that way. And I said, are you loaded? Are you so rich? And they're like, yeah, we are rich. It's too cost prohibitive to do it in a way that doesn't destroy embryonic life. So what countries are doing it well? Germany is very sensitive about falling into a eugenics trap, so they don't allow embryo screening. And they also limit the number of embryos that can be created. Italy just banned surrogacy for everybody. The headlines were, Italy bans gay couples from becoming parents. And the answer is no, biology prohibits gay couples from becoming parents. Italy just said that you're not allowed to purchase, procure, design, and then bring them into the country in the name of gay rights. So there's very few countries that are doing this well. There are a lot of countries that have banned surrogacy on the grounds that it victimizes women and children. There's not a lot of countries that I think are doing IVF well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, Mrs. Faust. My question is, what's the relationship between the IVF industry and the social Darwinist movement?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would have to learn more about what social Darwinism is, but if you're just talking about kind of survival of the fittest and eugenics, that is what this is. So neo-eugenics is where we're at. And I was having this debate on X, right before I got into my rental car. And somebody said, we're not designing babies in IVF. And I'm like, you're right, you're not. You're just mass producing them and eliminating the ones that you don't like. And we're not just, I think it's egregious enough to screen out children with Down syndrome or genetic defects, but we're getting to the point now where we've got 2 or 3 different high-end genome profiling companies like Orchid that will screen your child for 900 to 1,200 different characteristics. So we're not just talking about genetic abnormalities. We're really on the edge of determining IQ, height. We already have boutique clinics in California where 90% of their clientele are not infertile. They just want to choose the eye color of their children. And they can. You can know whether or not a child has blue eyes. And not just blue eyes, but 5 different shades of blue. And you're not making a child with that specific shade of azul eyes. You're eliminating the children that don't have that shade of azul. And so I would say that 100% is a Darwinian idea, right? That, the fittest need to survive, and this is what we got to do, this is what we got to do. I'm sure that somebody here at Hillsdale can give you a more academic answer than that. But that's where we're at, right? We really are selecting the desirables, and for at least right now, it's the wealthy that are going to be able to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. Also want to say hi from my friends at Created Equal. We had you talk a few years ago.
Tell Created Equal I love them.
My question is specifically one about the church. So I come from a pastor family, and I've talked to my parents a lot about the issue of IVF in the church. This is of course for evangelical Protestants. I know for Catholics it's different. But is this an issue we should take a firm stance against from the pulpit? I think in the Protestant church you often hear this. There's this idea of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 issues. Like tier 1 would be you're not a Christian if you disagree. Tier 2 would be you're a different denomination. Tier 3 would be you're a different sect of that denomination. How would you say, and you're an evangelical Protestant as well.
Yeah.
Are you married to a pastor? Is that
Married.
right? Okay, great.
Like we're in this for life.
Yeah.
Katie.
How would you say is the best way to navigate this in the church?
You need to frame it as a matter of child protection. So I understand that we're not talking about the nature of God here or the nature of salvation, but we are talking about what is the nature of man. And that ultimately is where all of the theological battles are today. I raised my kids in Seattle. They largely went to public school. There wasn't a lot of people walking up to them going, tell me about the incarnation. I'm really curious about that. They were all saying, do you go to a church that loves gays or hates gays? Right? Why aren't you using my pronouns? Wait, I'm gonna unfriend you because you spoke out about the Georgia bill that says that the heartbeat bill is a good idea. So all of the major battles that we're having today, I would say, are not about the nature of God or the nature of salvation. It's all about what does it mean to be human. And actually, that is the church's lane. The church, that is our lane. We know what it means to be human. We understand that people are made in the image of God and therefore endowed with dignity. We understand that that extends to the weak and the old and the sick and the young and the born and the unborn. And we are the ones, Christians, who in every country that we've visited, every century that we've existed, have consistently done something, whether it's in Ethiopia or China or in the UK. And that is, we have pissed off adults to protect children. There are a variety of different cultural threats that come against kids, whether it's foot binding or female genital mutilation or conscripting street kids to be laborers in factories for 16 hours a day. And it is the Christians who say, over my dead body. It's the Christians who put an end to infanticide. It's the Christians who run into the temple and free the children being used as sexual slaves. Because our God says that part of our pure and undefiled religion before him is to protect kids. And he is the one that says, and if you don't, or if you're participating in causing them to stumble, you deal with me and I have corporal punishment for you. So the church need to understand that our mandate is not to be welcoming and affirming of adults, not even adults that we love who are dealing with infertility in our congregation. Our job is child protection. And if we are not serious about child protection, we actually don't get to claim membership in this great cloud of witnesses that have gone before us. So I don't know if it's a salvation issue, but it definitely is you are misunderstanding what time it is kind of issue. And you're understanding what the job of the church is right now. And unfortunately, I think too many, first of all, Protestants they've just been late to the game in terms of understanding how extreme this is and how dangerous it is. They've not done a good job of connecting this to child protection. They've looked at it primarily through the lens of, we feel bad for our friends who are adults who are suffering, whether they've got same-sex attraction or they're in a struggling marriage or they've got infertility or they're single and they haven't found Mr. Right and they would be a great mom. We have allowed adult feeling to shape our response to this, when our response needs to be grounded in child protection. So when I started talking about this in 2018, everybody just assumed I was Catholic because there were no Protestants talking about it. But now, after this, I'm going to Texas and I'm going to speak at a conference called Share the Arrows, which is put on by Allie Beth Stuckey. Okay, now Allie Stuckey is all up in the IVF surrogacy thing because she clearly understands the threat to kids. So the good news is when Protestants hear it, that this is a matter of child protection, it has to do with fighting for their right to life, they get it and they get on board. But we've got a lot of education to do and we need to help them see it from the right perspective, which is a human dignity perspective, grounded in the nature of humanity and the nature of the human child, and we need to defend the kids. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Mrs. Voss. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about embryonic adoption. And you were talking earlier about the biological identity that is lost when children are taken from their parents at the moment of conception. If there was a family that had a closed embryonic adoption because the other family wanted that, do you have any advice or have you talked to any couples that have been raising their child in a way that they can support and love that child even though they don't have that connection with their genetic family?
Yeah, so if I understand what you're saying, because it was a little hard to hear you. If somebody is raising a child where there's a closed adoption and the child doesn't have identifying information about their parents, how can the adoptive parents best support the child? Okay, that's our situation, right? Our child was abandoned in China. And in China, it's illegal to abandon your child. And so birth parents are careful to leave no identifying information because they would be punished, supposedly, if they were discovered. And so no Chinese adoptee has information about their birth parents. So what you can do is you can enter into the grief with your child. And you actually can say, that must be so hard. I understand why you're struggling. And they're going to struggle, and they're going to mourn, and they're going to have questions. Like, I cannot fully compensate for everything that my son has lost. But what I can do is I can grieve with him. So at least he's not processing it alone. And that sometimes is the best that you can do. Now, nobody thought, even 20 years ago, that you could swab your cheek and discover your entire family tree through Ancestry.com. So now that's a possibility. So I would say that that's something that parents should be open to, that if their child is like, this is really important to me. Some adoptees say, this is so important to me, I can't think about anything else. Some of them will say, it's not that big of a deal. Very often, I've found, because one thing we do at Them Before Us is we catalog the stories of children who have lost their mother and father through a variety of different ways. I have found that very often it's not as pressing, or it's harder for them to articulate when they're very young. Often it's 10 years out of the home when they first go, wait a second, this might really have affected me. Often it's when they get married and have their own children that they go, oh my God, this is what it's like for a dad to be in his child's life every day. Oh, I can't believe what I was missing. And then sometimes the older that you get, the more you go, actually, I think that really matters to me. So adoptive parents these days are coached. It's literally like word for word. I think it's required in every home study that the adoptive parents understand that adoption is a lifelong process where they're going to have different levels of understanding and grief and questions as the child grows. And that's really true, right? My son right now is scared of the idea of meeting his parents, his biological parents. And I'm like, that's fine. I just want to let you know that if you've got questions, we'll try to figure it out. But as he ages, maybe when he becomes a dad himself, that might be the kind of thing that he has more questions about. I just think you just enter into wherever your child is. You connect with them, you mourn with them, you validate them. And that's honestly something that I think we've gotten wrong on the right. We have been so concerned about mentioning any kind of drawback or downside to adoption because we don't want people to rush towards abortion. But the truth is we can do both. We can say children have a right to life. They shouldn't be aborted. And there's really something special about the maternal-baby bond that is hard for the mom and the baby when it's missing. Like, we can do both. We can recognize that children have a right to life and a right to their mother, and tragedy can interrupt that, but it's not something that should be minimized. Yeah, thanks.
All right, we've got time for just 2 more quick questions. So
Better
Katie
be
should
good.
be available for 15 or 20 minutes
Yeah.
after the talk is over, so please feel free to talk with Katie afterwards.
Thank you so much for your time. My question is related to the last one. My 2 youngest brothers are twins, and they were embryo adopted in an open adoption. You compared the statistics of identity struggles to kids born through surrogacy compared to kids adopted at a later age. Is there any data yet on kids like my little brothers?
No, there's no data on embryo adopted kids. There's probably only 200 or 300 that are adopted every year. And I'm talking adoption. Embryos are donated all the time, donated to research, donated to other couples. We don't track those kinds of things. If you're going to relinquish children because you are 58 or because the parents have died or something, it needs to be a real adoption. We're not acquiring a couch. We're adopting children. So we need to abide by whatever possible the best practices of adoption, like keeping sibling groups together, having an open adoption whenever possible, making sure that the adoptive parents are undergoing the screening and the vetting because they're unrelated and it poses risks to children. So we don't have data on that yet. And it will probably be a long time before we do get good data, because the way you get good data is, number one, to find those kids at random, not to go to their parents when they're 8 and say, hey, how's your kid doing? Oh, they love it? Oh, this is great? Awesome. You need to go to your brothers when they're 28 or 38 and say, how did that impact you? What kind of identity struggles did you have? What kind of attachment did you feel to your parents? Were you more likely to be on welfare? Were you more likely to experience abuse? I mean, that's how you really evaluate kind of alternative family structures, is by finding the kids at random and asking them themselves after they've grown. So it will be decades before we have that kind of data. Right now, we've got some stories, but we don't even have a lot of them, right? Because this is still very new. So most of the kids that were embryo adopted are under the age of 18. So it's going to be a while before we have that. But I hope that they're doing well. There's a lot of differences between embryo adoption and regular adoption. But the downside is they're going to have questions that traditional adoptees don't have. Some of those questions may be hard to answer. The one advantage they have is they didn't lose their birth mother. They continued to have that attachment and that bond. So hopefully that same primal wound is going to be absent for them. They may still have the identity struggles, but hopefully they will not have that jarring setback as it relates to kind of the foundation of relationship. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you for having this talk. What I'm wondering about is, in this specific situation where a child has a genetic abnormality which would likely cause them to die before they're born, do you think that IVF would be acceptable as a way to genetically modify them so that they won't die before they're born if you only do one embryo at a time, no sort of screening process, keep the same parents and they're taking care of them their whole life? the only point of the IVF being to take them out so that they have a chance at surviving?
So my understanding is we don't have IVF. Well, okay, there is a technology where you can edit children called CRISPR, where you can genetically modify them. That's not what IVF is. So IVF is not reparative. It is selective, right? You're selecting the children that don't have the conditions that you're trying to avoid. So you're mass producing embryos so that you can eliminate the ones that have the genetic abnormalities that you want to resist. The gene editing is a different technology that is still highly controversial and not widely used because it's illegal in most places. So IVF is different from, it's not therapeutic. So maybe I'm misunderstanding your question.
Yeah, so my question is basically if it could be used, if the technology of fertilizing an egg outside, like in glass, could be used coupled with genetic modification specifically for the purpose of saving the life of a single embryo, and all of this, of course, wouldn't be currently legal because they don't recognize that embryo as a person, and therefore genetic modification, there would be no reason for it. But we would recognize this as a person, so there might actually be a reason to try to save their life.
So as far as I know, that technology, unless you're talking about gene editing, that technology doesn't exist where you can modify an embryo. And again, CRISPR, they've got that on their sites. There's all kinds of dystopia coming towards us. Gene editing is just one of them. But I don't think that anybody is trying to modify an embryo to make it healthier. There really is no point when you can just mass produce embryos and pick the one that you want. They are working towards things like a 3-parent embryo where you're taking out the mitochondria and putting it in a healthy egg and having trace amounts of one parent and then having 2 genetic parents. They're working on something called in vitro gametogenesis. In fact, there was just news that they have successfully created a human egg-ish and fertilized it using a skin cell, I believe, which is people. It's so bad, right? If you can create sperm is very easy to get to. Eggs are harder to get to. So if you can create an egg through saliva or through blood or through skin cells and cut women out of the process altogether, do you understand how much money we're going to save? We're going to save so much money. And then you can have 2 men that are genetically related to the child. The child won't have a mother. They'll have the egg from one man's skin cell and the sperm of another man. And the nice thing is a man can be both father and mother to a child. So that's nice, right? He can be the egg and the sperm. I mean, what we're on the cusp of, if we don't get things right now as it relates to IVF and surrogacy, it doesn't get better. We've got robot nannies, we've got artificial wombs that China's developing, we've got the IVG where we're making babies through soma, different cells. We've got CRISPR where we're editing children, and we don't yet know if you can edit out that one thing without other things going wrong. I mean, we've got so much child experimentation on the docket in the name of giving adults what they want. So it's just an area where I think we need a whole crop of child defenders and bioethicists to rise up and build a firewall around kids and say, if you want to experiment on a human, you can do it on yourself, but don't do it on kids. Yeah. All right. Thank you.